Welcome back. Now, South Africa is at the helm of the G20 and will be hosting the Intergovernmental Forum later this year under the theme Solidarity, Equality and Sustainability. This at a time when solidarity is lacking, particularly between itself and the US amid other rising geopolitical tensions rooted in foreign policy. Peter Attard-Montalto has penned a piece titled, "Why Should the World Take South Africa's Foreign Policy Seriously?" He joins us with greater perspective on this as we focus on South Africa's deteriorating bilateral relations with the US ahead of the G20 summit. Peter, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. And I guess let's start there, zooming in on those bilateral relations. How do you rate South Africa's response to what's been going on? And does it even matter if SA responds, considering that Trump's administration does whatever it likes without having any formal communication?
Good afternoon. Great to be back with you. I think the US relations were always going to get rocky, I think, as long as South Africa charged down this somewhat performative route of relationships with Iran, with others that were upsetting the Democrats, let's not forget. The Democrats under the previous administration were already pretty concerned, but they decided to largely sweep it under the carpet. And now the reemergence, obviously, of the Republicans, and obviously particularly this sort of brand of them, has put things out into the open. And I think you need some simple cost-benefit analysis. What stance on foreign policy is ultimately in the best interests of whatever is important to the country? And ultimately, that is obviously jobs, it's development in the broadest sense of the word. And I think that's really where, I think there's a lot of frustration in the country from business and from others around the lack of pragmatism here. No one is saying don't have a human rights, based or a solidarity-based foreign policy, but ultimately you need to know what side your bread is buttered on.
And then how do we strike the balance when it comes to our foreign policy? I don't want to say to keep everyone happy, but how do we go about applying tact in our foreign policy?
Well, India is the best example of this, where I think you've seen a lot of nuance coming through, where they maintain cordial relations with the Trump administration, whilst being pretty close to both Russia and China at the same time. I think the issue with South Africa is much more about the lack of trust, really, fundamentally. The lack of trust over a very long period of time. I think there's been far too much focus on Ibrahim Rasool, and people have forgotten that the actual mission there is exceptionally weak. There are not people turning up, for instance, at meetings on the Hill, at think tank meetings. There simply is a lack of relationship depth of South Africa into the US. And I think a lot of this is a misunderstanding, is maybe a too simplistic way of putting it, but there's a lack of trust fundamentally there that needs to be built up and will take quite some time to build up. And that's why fundamentally we think a pound of flesh will be extracted first before a deal can be done between South Africa and the Trump administration.
Peter, do you think that perhaps, we are tiptoeing around the issue because AGOA still hangs in the balance?
Not particularly. I think everything coming out of DC seems to suggest that AGOA will be lost. There's some debate over the timing. We think it will be lost in April. It can be, Zach can be booted out any time under an executive order. You don't have to wait for the renewal in September. We think that will be part of the pound of flesh, potentially visa bans as well, alongside we're kicking out of the ambassador, which has now obviously happened already. We've obviously also seen what's happened with the removal of funding, albeit that's a much broader thing. And we should not forget as well that there's this much bigger global thing going on, a big investigation the Trump administration is doing around reciprocal tariffs. And I think the framing of reciprocal tariffs around South Africa, where the Trump administration views BEE almost as a tariff type, pay to play, if you like, in South Africa, is actually going to be very, very interesting. And we shouldn't forget that as well. So we might see additional tariffs on top as part of that global reciprocal tariff push. But that's a sort of package of pound of flesh of punitive measures that we see coming. And South Africa's going to have to take it. I think then we move on from there and try and find where a deal can be done after that.
And let's just look at the position South Africa finds itself in, assuming, the G20 presidency at a crucial time. You've mentioned, tariffs and, everything happening when it comes to the macroeconomic picture. There's also, a shift in the world order where we are seeing, the tensions with the East and the West, and where I guess the global South fits in it all.
Well, the Global South has a lot to offer the US. I think we shouldn't forget that. US companies want to base themselves in South Africa. Microsoft, big announcement the other week. Amazon, AWS has been in South Africa for quite some time and leads a lot of its coding out of South Africa. People forget that this Cape Town is a sort of strange, forgotten hub for Amazon, actually. And I think the lesson from this fundamentally is that there is a productive and good relations in trade and investment that can be had. South Africa provides certain chemicals to the US, and the strategic mineral story as well, which also shouldn't forget. And I think it actually exposes, I've tried digging into this and what South Africa can offer the US on critical minerals, strategic minerals. The government is nowhere on a critical minerals plan or sort of policy push. And I think it really exposes the risk of trying to find a deal and of trying to deal with the US when you don't have your domestic ducks in a row on some of these issues.
And on the other side, we have, our partnerships or our relations with BRICS and countries in the East and our relations in Africa. I want to zoom in on BRICS a bit and its place in the world, just providing somewhat of an alternative global order, which seems to be threatening the West's dominance. I mean, Trump making a tariff threats on the back of talks of de-dollarization. We've also seen the expansion of BRICS with countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia joining.
Well, the BRICS is very interesting. I mean, if you exclude China, it's obviously a very, very small bloc, and trade between South Africa and China would probably be the same regardless of if BRICS existed or not. And fundamentally, the China relationship is obviously very complex. South Africa is struggling with exactly the same questions that the Republican Party are in the US about what the nature of importing consumer goods is from a country like that, and what it does to jobs. But I think fundamentally we shouldn't forget what happened under the Biden administration. South Africa was very quick under the Biden administration to deny that it was going to join or take any part in forming a BRICS currency.
Yeah.
And so the sensitivity around this again is not entirely around Trump and is not really new. There is a big, I think, risk aversion as well amongst many international financial institutions around the nature of a BRICS currency that would ultimately, the fear is, be used to sidestep sanctions, terrorist financing constraints, and things like that. It's already possible to trade bilaterally between countries. That's not the issue here. The issue is the systems which would allow you to bypass sanctions and terrorist financing controls.
And Peter, before I let you go, how nervous are you about, or are you nervous about, the US taking the G20 presidency after South Africa? I mean, yes, the year is long and we could strike a deal and we could have better relations just before the summit. But looking at things right now, it doesn't seem like, anything could be fixed anytime soon.
Well, I think it depends where you put the bar on what the G20, B20 and others can really achieve, regardless of the US taking over or not. And I think, I'm slightly involved in some of this. And, I think the therapy I've sort of done for myself, if you want to put it that way, is that there are some really important conversations that are happening regardless of what the US does. Some of the very important conversations between investors and African sovereigns that are going on as part of this agenda. Some of the very important conversations around things like adaptation financing. As well. So there's a lot of important shift of the dial and shift of the narrative that can happen, and South Africa can help happen with G20 and B20 this year, regardless of if the US takes the stuff over. Now, obviously, it would be preferable they did, but I don't think it's essential necessarily they do to see change in some important global policy agenda areas.
Peter, thanks so much for your time and just sharing your insights. That was Peter Attard-Montalto from Crutham. We'll bring you a monthly focus on the G20 at the end of each month until the summit kicks off in November.